Soundstripe.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Natalie Wisewoman Podcast, a place where the wise women and men of this world sit down and discuss topics related to becoming your highest potential. Enjoy this episode. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Natalie Wisewoman Podcast. Today I'm back here with Dr. Owen Roberts, and we are going to cover the topic of tarot. In the previous episode I did with Dr. Owen about shamanism and nature as spiritual practice. Owen mentioned that he has been working basically with tarot since he was 17 years old when he got a tarot deck, and you can go back and listen to that episode if you're interested. Owen is teaching spiritual studies at Green Tarot College and has been teaching tarot for 20 years and working with tarot for 48 years. So I'm honored and happy to have you here and share your expertise on tarot. I think tarot can be very misunderstood, especially in the kind of among common man. So I wanted to discuss some topics that have been coming up and also generally what tarot is. So today we will first talk about what tarot is, and then it's quite interesting in the Swedish media, national TV, SVT, there has been this documentary series that has been made on different spiritual things like crystals and energy healing and tarot. So there was a whole episode on tarot where basically it was kind of very fear-based. I would call it propaganda, but they were saying that it's very dangerous that people are substituting psychology visits for tarot readings, and I don't think that is the purpose of tarot readings, and we will go into that topic as well today. And I think the underlying question there is kind of the whole viewpoint of the Western healthcare system, that we don't trust that an individual is capable of making their own decisions of what will actually help them when they have challenges or when they go through something difficult. Like we have to scare them into something because, you know, if they follow their intuition, then that's wrong. So that kind of bridges to the topic of giving people advice, and I think that's a very, very profound thing that I have understood that has been very helpful in not only my therapy work, but also in other sessions like tarot readings and all these things. Like, what are the implications of giving people advice? So I want to go into that topic as well. But first, so let's start with tarot. If you briefly could tell to someone that doesn't really know anything about tarot, knows that it's a bunch of cards or something, like what is tarot?
Okay, tarot is a Western European divination system that can be used for a variety of different purposes. At one level, it's used as party entertainment, and that's got about as much spiritual depth to it as any other form of party entertainment, but isn't necessarily a bad thing so long as you understand that that's all it is. To the other extreme, it's a profound, very, very deep system of encoding spiritual teachings and can be used as a path of spiritual development in and of itself. In between those two extremes, we have tarot readings. And like any other area of activity which isn't regulated in any way, shape, or form, you get every variety of reading, from extremely profound, spiritually enlightened readings through to fraud and, for the most part, a lot of rubbish, basically shallow, made up pop psychology at best. So it's got everything from the most profound to the most trivial usage, and the most wise to the most stupid. It's originally started in Italy. We don't know exactly when. The first printed tarot cards appear in 1420. They're clearly a highly developed, sophisticated system by that time. It's clear that the very first printed cards couldn't have been the very first tarot set, because of the depth of sophistication in the design and the complexity, and also because we have multiple decks appearing at roughly the same time in different parts of Europe, and they're all the same. So that clearly shows that in the medieval period, before we had printing, we had the tarot deck developing and getting pretty much to its current state, with the 4 minor arcana suits and the 22 major arcana cards. So it appears then as a card game. It may have also been used as a form of divination. We don't know, because that's not the sort of thing that was printed in books at that time. The very first book describing using it as divination comes from, I think, around about 1720. And then we get 2 or 3 books appearing in France on how to use the tarot cards as for divination over the space of about 5 years from 2 different people. So it can be used for a wide variety of purposes, because it is primarily a set of depictions of archetypes. And because archetypes are universal patterns in all human minds, they can take on a number of roles. An archetype is primarily an inbuilt genetic way of processing our experience of the world. So we have things like archetypes for the mother, because you need to be able to tune in on the idea of mother, and that there's a person who has that role in your life as soon as you're born, well before you get a chance to learn about the world and understand it and learn to communicate and so on. So we are built with pre-built structures for processing the world. The archetypes are a sophisticated combination. The tarot cards are a sophisticated combination of archetypes, some of which are quite straightforward, such as the Fool, which is the first card in the tarot deck. The Fool, or the clown figure, is a universal figure in almost all religions and cultures, from the Hopi right the way through to medieval Europe, to China, Africa, and so on. So the card is depicting a European fool character, but you'd find the same meaning, the same attributes, the same qualities in any culture in the world. So in their physical form, they're a set of cards. What they get used for, because they do contain profound imagery and profound ideas and a fairly sophisticated system, can vary from, as I say, light entertainment through to profound spiritual development.
So if we go into the topic of kind of healthcare and what was presented in this documentary, that people would use it as a substitute for getting care for mental health issues or diagnosis or something. What's your viewpoint on that? And how can you spot if someone is actually not giving a good tarot reading? Because I know that you have a lot of kind of rules and you're quite strict about what we are supposed to doing a reading. Like in class, you teach this stuff, and I think that's really important. And I know that not every reader actually follows these things. So what are some of the indications for a person that maybe this is not the right, like somebody's maybe trying to manipulate you or use, for their own benefit?
Okay, so there's a number of issues there. When it comes to using the tarot as a form of diagnosis for a medical or psychological condition, I think that's appalling. I think that's unethical. I seriously doubt that it's being done by qualified psychotherapists. There's nothing to stop an amateur claiming any form of mystical knowledge to do medical or psychological diagnosis. The problem there is not with the system. The problem is with the individual and with the patient who's idiot enough to take their advice from them. As a psychological technique in psychotherapy, it is well accepted and works very well, because it is a set of archetypal images, and so can be used like the equivalent of an ink blot test to allow the individual to project their own inner state out onto the card and verbalize it in the same way as in, for example, Jungian psychotherapy. You could do sand play, where you create a sand painting, a sand pattern in a sandbox of devices and things, and you can put little plastic figures in and so on, and you can make a three-dimensional representation of your inner state. Or you can do the same thing with spontaneous writing or spontaneous dance and so on. So the tarot works extremely well for that and has been used for decades in that way. This is what's going on when somebody, for example, draws one card as their theme for the day. They're not getting a single thing off the tarot. The tarot is not making predictions about the day. All that is happening is the person is using that as a way of projecting their own inner state out into the world and then thinking about it and contemplating it. A similar sort of thing is going on with 3-card readings, which are absurdly popular, given that they have absolutely no value as a form of divination whatsoever. There's simply not enough cards there to get any real understanding, in addition to which tarot readings don't work as a form of divination without a question, except in very rare cases. They're designed to answer specific questions. So if somebody wants to use the cards as a form of psychotherapy, as a way of discovering more about their inner state, making their inner feelings more concrete and more accessible, I've got no problem with it, and it's a perfectly acceptable way of doing certain forms of talking psychotherapy. But in my view, and from my background, and certainly the Western occult tradition from which the tarot is being carried by these days, if you want a medical diagnosis, you go to a doctor. If you want a psychological diagnosis, you go to a psychiatrist. The tarot is not a substitute for science.
So what happens in a reading then, if a person is actually a reading?
Okay, so I'm following, my training comes from Western occultism. Western occultism is the mystical side, not necessarily Christian side of the Western spiritual tradition. So it encompasses both Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. It doesn't contradict any of those. It puts an inner meaning behind them and derives spiritual practices from them. So the primary initiator of Western occultism today comes from the Golden Dawn, which was an organization from 1880 to 1920, based in London. It had famous people like Aleister Crowley, Dion Fortune, Paul Foster Case, Arthur Edward Waite in it. Arthur Edward Waite was the creator with Pamela Coleman Smith, and another member of the Golden Dawn, of the Rider-Waite tarot deck. That's where we get the name Waite from. Rider was the publisher. Waite was the guy who did the initial design and wrote the descriptions. Pamela Coleman Smith was the artist who did the bulk of the work, but of course it was 1910 and she was a woman, so she doesn't get a mention. Though really it should be called the Pamela Coleman Smith Tarot because it's 90% her work. They have a strong set of teachings. The tarot deck that Waite and Pamela Coleman Smith came up with is a reflection of the spiritual teachings of the Golden Dawn. So it's very much a Western occult system. So in terms of what is going on when you do a tarot reading, I'm deriving my information from the Golden Dawn and their understanding of it, and particularly a lot of writing that Aleister Crowley did on it. In Western occultism, we recognize the existence of angels to a much wider level than is normally talked about in traditional Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In the Western occult view, every aspect of life has an angel responsible for it. So there is an angel of tarot readings. Different names applied by different people. Aleister Crowley used the name Hoodoo, which we think was derived from Horus, who's the god of prophecy in the ancient Egyptian religions. So my belief is that when you do a tarot reading, if you're doing it properly, what is happening is you are passing the question to the angel of the tarot, Huru, who is then rearranging the cards while the client shuffles them into a pattern that he knows the tarot reader will understand in a way that enables them to convey the correct information to the client. This is individual to the tarot reader. The tarot reader has to have a strong connection with their own cards, a psychic connection to them, which comes from doing things like carrying them around and shuffling them and so on, which is why most professional readers carry their cards with them all the time. It helps build up the energy connection between the person and the cards. The Huru rearranges the cards through the shuffling act into a sequence that the reader can then use to answer the question. But that sequence and which cards are used to convey what meanings will be completely unique to that individual reader. This is why one professional reader cannot provide an interpretation of another person's cards or layout, cannot say that the person doing the reading was right or wrong. You cannot understand another person's tarot layout. It's totally down to you and your relationship with them. So what happens then is the cards are laid out, and the person who's doing the reading uses a combination of whatever intellectual training they've given themselves into the meaning of a lot of the symbols and the colors and so on that are in there. So, for example, in the star card, we have an 8-pointed star, which Waite describes as the blazing star. He doesn't tell you what that means, but if you do your research, you will find out that the blazing star is a figure in the Masonic tradition to symbolize the inner spiritual drive within a person. So if you understand, if you see that image appear, that star appear, you know it is a reference to the person's inner spiritual journey. And so on. We have things like, in a few of them, we have a snake biting its tail. This is Ouroboros. This is a symbol of eternity, of change, and so on. So you use your intellectual knowledge of the symbols contained within the individual cards, combined with a trained psychic intuition, which allows additional messages to come through, because any of the symbols in the cards could take on multiple meanings. It's up to your intuition under the guidance of Huru to indicate to you what is the correct meaning. So to do a proper professional tarot reading requires both psychic development and training, intellectual training in the language of the symbols. Tarot is using what is called Ars Memoria. Ars Memoria is a system of encoding knowledge we used before we had printing. In those days, excuse me, it was simply too expensive to buy a book. Every book had to be copied by hand. It was months of labor. So a book before the invention of the printing press cost the equivalent of about $250,000. Nobody had books. You had to memorize everything. We've therefore got thousands of years of people having to learn everything by memorization. So they developed extremely sophisticated systems for memorizing knowledge, which became known as Ars Memoria. This is the art of memory in Latin. And it basically uses images to remind you of ideas. So, for example, as we've just described with the blazing star, when I see that picture, that symbol, it is supposed to remind me of the Masonic rituals that are associated with it and all the inner meaning that goes with that. So I'm using Ars Memoria as an intellectual technique combined with an intuitive drive and guidance from Huru to provide the appropriate information to the client. So in my view, a tarot reader is a translator. They are translating from spiritual language into the language of the client. And they shouldn't do anything more than a translator would do, which is simply try to convey the messages they see in the tarot cards as cleanly and as purely as possible, with as little of themselves in it as possible.
That sounds very sophisticated in a way.
Yeah, well, it's a high art. It's not the sort of thing you can't go buy a pack of tarot cards, open up a book of meanings, and start doing decent tarot readings. Well, you can for party entertainment value, but it's not real stuff. It's just playing around. And that's fine if that's all you want to do with it. But if you're using that level, of just like looking it up in a book or a website, oh, this card means this and this card means that. For God's sake, don't let it run your advice or give you advice. You can have fun with it, but don't take it and make decisions on the basis of it. You just mess yourself up.
So before we go into the advice thing, I have to ask you, so before I knew anything about tarot, I heard from a friend who was playing the tarot cards that there are good or bad cards, and she was very scared when the devil came. And I've learned, like, doing tarot readings, that actually the devil card is very helpful for me because it has a lot of meaning in it. So can you kind of touch on that? Are there any good or bad cards?
No, there's no such thing as good or bad. This is something that I struggle with students when they're learning to read quite a lot. The only way to tell if an event is good or bad in someone's life is to see the full consequences of that action. There are plenty of people out there that have had what look like disasters in their lives, such as becoming quadriplegic or getting a life-threatening disease that they struggle with, things like this, who then afterwards say, actually, it was the best thing that happened to me because it led me to do this, or it led to this opportunity, or things like that. So similarly, the majority of the people that win over 50 million in a lottery anywhere in the world are bankrupt within 5 years. It's worse for them than never having received the money in the first place. It turns out that having huge quantities of money takes some serious skill to cope with, and if you don't have those skills, you can really ruin your life. So the only way to find out whether an event in someone's life is good or bad is to see the full range of their life up to the moment of death and what the long-term consequences were. And since they're still alive while you're doing the reading, unless they drop dead on the table in front of you, you've no way of knowing whether an event is good or bad, because they've still got years ahead of them, we hope. And if they do, point finishing the reading anyway, because they can't hear anymore. So the very idea, and in addition to which, good or bad are a judgment by the reader, and the client might not agree that this is a good or a bad thing. So if I tell somebody they're going to become pregnant, I don't know if that's good or bad. If they're 12 years old, it's not a good thing. If they're trying to get pregnant and they're in their 20s, it's a good thing. So things are not good or bad in and of themselves. And so the cards that indicate an event can't be good or bad either. Again, it depends on what the card means, and it depends on what the long-term consequences are. So we're never really in a position to judge any event or any card as good or bad. The cards are just cards. What they mean and what the consequences are depends on the person, the situation, and it also largely depends on how the client reacts. If I tell somebody, oh, I see you're drinking a lot and you're going to turn into an alcoholic, that looks like a bad thing. But if they use that information to stop drinking and avoid becoming an alcoholic, then that same information was a good thing. So I don't know how the client's going to react. And the theory is that by doing the reading in the first place, I give them the opportunity to react in ways that they wouldn't have reacted previously because they didn't have that information. The information of a tarot reading should change how they act. That's otherwise it hasn't really had any effect. It hasn't had any benefit.
Thank you. And also, good and bad is kind of a very Western thing. Like, they don't have that all over the world. Like, tarot, when they talk about harmony and disharmony, right?
Yeah, in some cultures don't do good or bad. Yeah. But it's always the important thing is it's always impossible to tell whether something is good or bad until, as I say, until you see the whole pattern of the life.
Yes. So I want to go into giving advice. The whole kind of Western medical system is built on this hierarchy where someone knows has a lot of information and then gives advice to someone about medical issues. And that's fine. And then we have the kind of, at least the Freudian therapy is kind of based on that, where also the therapist is giving advice to the client. And the therapy modality that I've been learning actually is against giving advice. So it's actually about getting the client to find their own solutions and find, their own advice, kind of, in a way. And you talk about advice and kind of the spiritual implications of giving advice, and also some tarot readers might be giving advice, but that's not something that you're teaching. So what is kind of your viewpoint on, and what are the implications when someone tells someone what to do?
Okay, so I think you need to distinguish between the medical giving advice, which I'm 100% in favor of, versus doing it in a tarot reading. If I am an expert in a field and the person needs guidance through that field, it's my job to give advice. That's the nature of the feature. If I go and see a consultant because I have a medical disease, I'm relying on their knowledge to tell me what to do. I'm not capable of deciding that for myself. I don't have the education. That's not what is going on in a tarot reading. Certainly you've got no business giving medical advice. That's just, and I don't know any tarot association or tarot readers that would consider giving medical advice through tarot readings as an ethical practice. They would all find that appalling. You're not capable. Maybe if you were a doctor, but then if you're a doctor, you should know better. You've got proper scientific ways of doing analysis and so on. What goes on in tarot that's a concern in giving advice is giving people life coaching, basically, telling them how to live their lives. The problem with that is you, as a reader, may or may not be qualified to do that, but certainly learning to do the tarot doesn't give you expertise in how other people should live their lives. There's nothing of that in the training. So then the question comes, where are you getting your ability to give advice? For the most part, what readers who give advice are doing is simply giving you their opinions. They know nothing more about life than anybody else. They're just telling you what they would do or what they think of your situation. They're making judgment calls. I don't agree with that, because I don't think most people are guru level spiritually developed enough to be in a position to do that. You have to be a master of spiritual development to do that. And the reality is 99.9% of all the spiritual practitioners in the world are not global level, perfectly evolved spiritual beings. We're all just flawed humans. From the Western occult point of view, the teaching on this is extremely strong because of karma and psychic connections. If I give somebody advice, I take on some of the karma that is generated by what they do with that advice, whether they follow it or not. If what I say changes them in any way, even if it's to go against what I say, I'm now at least partially responsible for the consequences of what happens. So every time I give advice to somebody, I'm going to share some of their karma. And imagine if I'm a professional reader doing 7, 8, 9, 10 readings a day. I could be accumulating 40 to 50 people's worth of karma per week in addition to my own. Next, will those people understand what I said perfectly, exactly the way I meant it? Or is there a chance some of them at least will misunderstand, either because I didn't express myself well or because they're simply too stupid to understand what I said? Next, can I trust them to use that advice to their highest good, or use that as extra information by which to manipulate people, hurt people, or do other things that are going to generate negative karma? So if I'm giving advice, I'm basically asking everybody I give advice to contribute to my karmic burden. From a Western occult point of view, that is a stupid, dangerous thing to do, because not everybody's going to understand what you say. Not everybody's going to use it the way you want. Some people are going to seek to use it to cause harm, and in some cases you could very well be wrong, but you're still going to get the full karmic consequences. So it's just considered dangerous In addition to which, as I've said, I've got an angel giving me information that I'm supposed to be passing through to the client. If I start giving advice, I didn't get that from the angel. And if you're tuned in on the psychic information that's coming through from tarot readings, they don't give advice. Spirit doesn't tell you what to do. It tells you what is. It's up to you what to do. That's the whole point of life on earth. Human beings have free will. We are incarnated to exercise that free will, to take responsibility for our own spiritual development through this life, and to work through our karma, and preferably not to add to it, and so on. So it's simply an inappropriate thing to do. If people want to come to me for life coaching, and I'm a life coach or a spiritual coach or a psychotherapist, and I choose to use tarot as a tool within that overall activity, I've got no problem with that. That's different from incorporating giving advice into a tarot reading, which is the reverse way of doing it. So similarly, I've had people I've come across who want to bless everybody before they give them a tarot reading, or bless them afterwards. And my attitude is, what made you some sort of special spiritual guru that can go around blessing everybody? I think that's pure ego. And similarly, the idea that you can do a reading on YouTube or something and apply it to tens of thousands of people that you've never met is just daft. You can't do global readings like that. Readings are between an individual practitioner and an individual client.
Thank you for
the reality is the at least half of what's going on in tarot professionally is a load of bunkum.
Yeah, and that's why I wanted to have this conversation, to kind of debunk those things. And so I wanted to ask you, do you have a reading in mind that you remember that was so profound that you kind of, at that point, you knew that this is real and this really works, that you either gave or someone gave to you?
Not really, because to be frank, when I started, I was about 4 years into it when I learned how to connect with Huru. And so for the bulk of the readings, I just listen to what he says in my right ear and I just repeat it. So most readings, I expect people to go, "Oh my God, how could you possibly know that?" And any good reader does have a box of tissues with them, because if you don't make at least one client cry a day, you haven't been going deep enough and hitting enough nerves. So I would regard it as a bit of a failed reading if people didn't walk out amazed and feeling that they got something really powerful and special. I'm not claiming any special ability by doing that. I think I can get anybody who's prepared to put the work in to that level in 6 to 12 months. That's not to underestimate the amount of work involved. I mean, we are talking hours of meditations and psychic exercises and study and hundreds, if not thousands, of pages of reading and so on. But it's achievable, and we know the techniques. The techniques have been in use in Western occultism for hundreds, if not thousands, of years. There's nothing revolutionary in that. It just requires an incredible amount of hard work. And the reality is that the bulk of people out there who've got a set of tarot cards have absolutely no interest in doing that level of work and dedication, which is fine if they want to, use it for their own purposes. But if you want to be a professional, if you want to take people's money for it, then I think you've got an obligation to do it to the best of your ability. And that means you put in some serious effort into training.
So for many people, tarot can seem very mystical, and it's some other people out there doing it. Do you think that anyone can on some level become psychic, or that you can develop these abilities to read?
Yeah. So it's generally accepted that most humans have psychic ability. I mean, it's even in the Bible, in Deuteronomy, it talks about all humans having psychic powers. The reason the Catholic Church, for example, is against humans using their psychic powers is because they believe, as it says in Deuteronomy, animals also have psychic powers. So if you're using your psychic abilities, you're actually exercising an animal characteristic, and you're making yourself more animal and less spiritual, and you're not supposed to do that. Therefore, you're not supposed to use your psychic powers. They can be used, of course, by a priest, because a priest has been properly educated by the church and can be trusted to be a spiritual person no matter what. However, the general belief is all people have psychic abilities. They require training. In some cases, a few people are born with them naturally, spontaneously, just working consciously, but for most people it requires training. It's the same way as most people have musical ability, but they require training. Very, very few people can teach themselves to a professional musical level without somebody coming in and giving them some training along the way. It's the same with psychic abilities. There are initiations you can receive, there are meditations you can do, there are mental exercises you can do, particularly visualization exercises and so on. And I've used those in the training for decades, and they work really, really well. And I'm not claiming anything special there. I am using the standard techniques for developing your psychic ability that are used in Western mystery schools. I learned mine from the Servants of the Light, which was a mystery school now ceased, that was derived from the Golden Dawn. I spent a number of years there studying it, and their techniques come from the Golden Dawn, who come from earlier organizations and so on, as far back in time as we can trace. Anybody can develop their psychic abilities if they're prepared to do the work, because once again, it's a question of doing the meditations and any other exercises every day for weeks, months, years, really. As I said, in my case, the first 4 or 5 years of doing probably an hour or two's meditation every day. Actually, personally, I think achieving psychic abilities in that space of time is quick, but it's a lot more commitment than most people are prepared to make already. So if you're prepared to do the work, you can develop the abilities. The second stage in using them is developing the confidence to say what the psychic information is telling you, what your intuition is telling you, because by its very nature, you don't have any evidence to back it up. So if you say, my intuition is telling me X, Y, Z, and somebody contradicts it and says, that's not true, there's no argument you can make to establish that it's true. You can't say, yeah, but this, therefore what I'm saying is true, which I could do if I was looking at an object or something like that. So it takes confidence to just say this stuff without having anything to back it up. I know for the first 2 or 3 years, every time I came to open my mouth in a tarot reading, I would be quivering with fear, because I'm going to say stuff and I have no way of knowing whether it's true or not. And if they say this is a load of rubbish, then I'm going to be devastated, and my shaky confidence is going to be destroyed, and so on. It's only by telling people things that I couldn't possibly know and having them confirm them as accurate over and over and over again that I eventually developed the ability to just go, okay, I'm going to trust this now and just let it flow. But that I think is harder than actually developing the abilities, having the confidence to just let it flow, and also developing the judgment to know this is just my imagination versus this is psychic information coming through, because often they feel almost identical. So sometimes it takes practice, and it takes a certain amount of self-knowledge to know where your prejudices are, where your biases are, and so on.
I think that's a great part of your training, is that if someone wants to become a professional reader, they actually have to do kind of practice the readings. And I think that was a good part, because that's where you get to test that, kind of get, feedback from someone that something that you should not have known, and then you build up that confidence. So I think it's not only about learning what the different symbols and all the intellectual stuff, but also the confidence part, like you're saying, is very important.
Yeah. Well, with the way I teach it, 1/3 of the course that I teach is meditation. There's a third in lectures, there's a third in reading, there's a third in meditation. They're all equally important. So you've got the intellectual knowledge, but you absolutely have to develop the psychic intuition. And then the idea is that they support each other. So if your psychic intuition is not firing fully, you've got the intellectual knowledge to fall back on, and vice versa. So if you're unsure about different meanings of a card, that's where the intuition comes in. So the two should work in harmony with each other.
So what offerings do you have currently for someone who would be interested in learning more about tarot, maybe becoming a professional tarot reader?
Well, we offer a 6-month course. The next one will be starting in September. That's once a week. So that's a 24-week course. So that's 44 hours of lectures, and then there's a reading list. It's not an extensive one if you do it on a regular basis, but we're probably looking at 2 or 3 hours worth of reading a week. And as well as that, there are meditations to be done once a week. Those are typically 20 minutes, guided visualizations, plus additional meditations that should take you somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes per day, plus work with the cards. So things like carrying the cards, learning how to manipulate them, doing readings. The way we do it is you can just do it as a course for interest. If you want to do it as a professional tarot readers course, then there are assignments that need to be submitted, and there's an exam that needs to be passed at the end. But it's a validated course in the sense that we've negotiated with insurance companies, shown them what we're teaching, and had them go, yeah, we will insure people who are working as tarot practitioners who've been certified by you, because we know they've been trained not to say stupid things like you should stop your cancer treatment and stuff like that, which is what insurance companies are really worried about with spiritual practitioners, that they will give inappropriate advice that can lead to problems.
Okay, thank you so much for this discussion, and people can find more on Green Tara's website. I will put it in the description. And if they have any questions, they can send me or to your website.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Soundstripe.